Hello everyone, this is Craig from Asset Horizon, and before we let Adam introduce today's episode, I just wanted to let you know I just came back from Brooklyn after our very successful event at Public Records and the Durations Festival with Stuart Kendall in an event titled The Headless Politics of George Bataille. I will probably be editing that video throughout this week and next, and so that's coming very soon. And now with that event behind us, those of us on the podcast would like to return to promoting Acephalus, the erotic tarot of George Bataille, this sort of didactic oracle that we're creating along with this attractive compendium featuring various essays on the work of George Bataille, anti-fascism, expenditure, all topics that are very relevant to the here and now. But I will say that only a limited number of people can and will get this. Of course, there will be a PDF for anybody who wants to read the text, but if you are a collector or you want to support the podcast in a very substantive way, this is a way to do it. We are making our foray into independent publishing at a time when some left-wing publishers are under threat. At the time that I'm recording this, we have about 20 days left in this campaign. And what's going to happen is about 10 to 15 people are going to pause the podcast and they're just going to navigate to the show notes and go ahead and click the Kickstarter link and support us by pre-ordering a book, a deck, or both. Or if you are a bookstore or know a bookstore, you can grab the book from our wholesale tier. There's something for everybody here, and it's a great way to support independent media, philosophy media, and particularly Asset Horizon. All right, with all of that out of the way, let's let Adam introduce today's guests.
Welcome to Asset Horizon, the Theory podcast. And today we are talking about one of the core topics of a lot of our works and a lot of the stuff we've dealt with in terms of our seminars and our wider community here, which is the philosophy of counter-insurgency, or rather the epistemology, the ways of knowing through which the state conducts a formal and informal war in terms of the management of populations, security, policing, and displacement, the forcing of people into labor, and the general structures which comprise our contemporary control society. Now, to talk about this time, we're actually joined by members of the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy here, the CCRA. No, not the CCRU. Some of you maybe have misread that, but we're not doing any cybernetic accelerations in this episode. I'm joined by Annie Paradise and Manolo Callahan. And today we're actually talking about Annie's book, The War on the Social Factory, The Struggle for Community Safety in the Silicon Valley, essentially looking at ways in which communities have come together to provide spaces of knowledge production to both better understand and better resist the situation regarding police violence, displacement, and disinformation in the age of the control society as we are currently living within it. Annie, Manolo, thank you so much for joining me today. So I just want to ask, first of all, about the CCRA, this knowledge production collective that you're all a part of. What is it? Where are its origins from, and what is your general sort of approach in terms of, what does it mean to do a convivial kind of research to generate new ideas of autonomy today?
Well, I can answer that, or get it started at any rate. The Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy really has two trajectories. One trajectory one trajectory was essentially a group of young people managing the university and mostly in graduate school, and that kind of critical moment when all of the centers, like ethnic studies centers, those Chicano studies centers, were basically kind of under attack by us, in the sense that the community, or this kind of newly minted faculty that was taking over these centers, somehow lost connection with the community in general, weren't really serving students, and were kind of really career oriented. And then the other side of that was the nonprofit industrial complex's emergence. And so the struggle was essentially being commodified for some form or shape of career advance. So we were trying to disrupt that, and the disruption for us was to create spaces of autonomous, what we now call autonomous spaces of learning, and try to network those spaces and produce new knowledges and reclaim what we now call historical knowledges of struggle, poetics, etc., in those spaces. and do everything that the research center could do, or the seminar, or the advanced seminar. And we were trying to, kind of play and subvert those categories and those spaces. That was one trajectory, and that was kind of unfolding. And, we had a Vadio Student Research Center and other kinds of community spaces that we were trying to be in between the community and the university to navigate, the production of these kind of elite knowledges and the role that these knowledges were producing in narrating us and so on. And the idea was that in trying to resist those knowledges, we were still maintaining the university and its control and its kind of dominance in terms of knowledge production. So fast forward to the Zapatistas, and we realized that the Zapatistas really had what we were trying to do resonated with what the Zapatistas were asking us to do, and that's to try and create our own spaces and resist neoliberalism in our own spaces, but with an emphasis of knowledge production and insurgent knowledges and processes of insurgent learning. So the idea with the Center for Convivial Research was to try to institutionalize that in some way, to create a break against the nonprofit industrial complex and the educational industrial complex, so that any interface could go through CCRA and not contaminated these kind of pristine spaces of community knowledge production and so on. So, CCRA is officially 501c3, but we don't really exist in any kind of real way, other than we are a small collective of folks that, build together, kind of think together. But the idea is to activate different kinds of spaces that can be, basic kind of workshop spaces, but are also what we call various nodes in a broader kind of linkage of temporary autonomous zones of knowledge production. And the idea is that movement struggle is constantly producing knowledge, and it's constantly redirecting institutional or dominant knowledges. So we want to be able to kind of bring that into focus, to much like we were saying when we were talking earlier, find moments to reverse engineer what the state is doing or what dominant systems are doing with regards to university as a kind of a key devices of modernity, and trying to produce very specific kinds of subjects and to disrupt all of that. So that's more or less how CCRA kind of started. It's obviously in dialogue with the Zapatistas, of course, but the other dialogue that it's in is with Ivan Illich and Ivan Illich's strategy around Sedesi, where the idea is to create a space to subvert American consumer culture, American capitalist consumer culture, and to try to find spaces to subvert that. So CCRA, and then this kind of counterpart with a kind of this active autonomous learning space, the Universidad de la Tierra, is very much in keeping with Illich's strategy that Gustavo Esteva also enacted in Oaxaca, and then there's several Universidades de la Tierra around Mexico and Colombia. I think there's one in Barcelona, and various groupings of various spaces that people have convened. So that's generally what CCRA is about.
Well, I could definitely also kind of segue into how the some of the work around community safety emerged in relation to CCRA and what we're doing in a period that basically kind of starts to take shape after the killing of Oscar Grant out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. But, one of the things the book that we're looking at, The War on the Social Factory, and in fact, the theorization of it as well, is one document. I think it's helpful to think of it as one document among many that are emerging from a kind of a multi-sided, interconnected series of struggles out here in the Bay Area that are working to claim autonomy and working to respond to, confront, push back against forms of militarized policing, forms of carcerality. And so, the book also feels like it exists alongside a number of other community archives that were produced around that time and continue to be produced through a kind of collective effort that would range from anything, wheat paste posters marking the dead, banners that people make to take over the streets, timelines that we worked on with folks that offer a documentation of police killings and police strategies by city, and that also document our resistances. And so I think that this, one of the things that we're also trying to theorize in our work as CCRA is this notion of community safety, and to try to think about how is a strategic concept does this allow us to mark certain resistances and a continuity and a resonance across resistances? How does it mark a moment of rupture where people are pushing back, as I said, against securitization, against all sort of ways that the state and capital are making their communities unsafe, pushing back against forms of criminalization, and to in opening this space with the term itself to kind of carve out a space for new knowledges to emerge, for us to see collectively the rupture that we're putting in place over time as we walk with families, as we walk with different organizations. What is this collective effort to claim a community safety in the conditions of the Fourth World War, borrowing from the Zapatistas. And we can talk more about ways that, some of what has emerged for us as a community safety has been a recognition, as we were speaking before, a recognition of different components that seem critical to communities as they're self-organizing themselves or organizing autonomously. And we've kind of broken that down collectively with other folks to think through, what are the components of a community safety? One being fierce care, as you named, this kind of refusal to let people be individuated by violence or, separated out through forms of criminalization and violence. So fierce care, where we claim each other against these modalities of separation, isolation that the state imposes through policing and other mechanisms. We look at forms of collective self-defense. How is the community organizing itself collectively to defend itself? We've looked at various strategies of documentation and also auto-representation. And this, I think, links a lot with what, both of you are speaking to as this space opened here around the idea of documentation and the idea of auto-representation that communities are engaging both inside. We worked with folks in prison who are also doing this, all kinds of forms of mapping and documenting, but that this is also becomes a strategy of refusing certain epistemological frames that security depends on, that it becomes a way of insisting on a number of insurgent knowledges, disqualified knowledges, to borrow from Foucault's insubordinate knowledges, insisting that these knowledges and our sharing of them and our listening to them collectively are part of a profound political project. So we have fierce care is a component, documentation, auto-representation, forms of collective self-defense, critically forms of autonomous justice. Again, all the ways that communities have organized themselves around their own understanding of justice that refuses to obey the forms of state-sanctioned justice that always come into play as a reinforcement of the state as part of the policing apparatus and post-police killings. So we've been theorizing a kind of community safety in this way, where all of those components are also always linked to forms of assembly. So forms of gathering, forms of speaking together, places where the knowledges that are emerging from these communities are able to circulate, to create a counterposition and a rupture in the current moment. And of course, this is all always existing alongside and in direct relation to direct actions and, street insurgencies and all of these kinds of things. But really, it's a we always say nobody invented community safety. It's happening everywhere. We've theorized it as a convivial tool that hopefully is one that we can share, that allows people to see different ways to see and to share tools across struggles in different locales. So that's where it emerged from an ongoing proliferation of experiments and tools in community safety and in motion.
Well, I mean, that's exactly what we need is these kind of networks, because sometimes the question of community safety often, at least in my experience, arrives in a way sort of too late sometimes. So in the UK where I am, the question of community safety and community self-defense has been on the forefront of multiple sort of marginalized communities. I'm not just talking about resistances to deportation raids. We've had anti-raids networks pop up, and they produce their own kinds of knowledges and pamphlets, and particularly legal knowledge that you wouldn't get from a standard governmental source that wants you to not be their problem more than anything else. Even in terms of, DIY HRT for trans comrades, it locked out of healthcare in the United States and the UK and increasingly other places as well. Even going so far as think of the recent pogroms, and listeners, they were pogroms that happened in the United Kingdom, and that's what we started talking about: community self-defense and knowledge production. And then in the UK, our knowledge production seems to be mostly rammed through our aristocracy, which we still haven't dealt with yet, and Rupert Murdoch. And so it's the idea of us making these kind of centers. I mean, I've seen more and more popping up over the last few years. I mean, typically it has been a question of land here, because but luckily of these spaces like we have here, of the online spaces, we can disseminate, we can build an informational architecture that's a bit more resilient to parts where land may not be as necessarily as easy to achieve, or to acquire. One thing I actually want to ask particularly, I know this project isn't just linked solely to San Francisco, but San Francisco, before we get into this concept, or maybe as a way of leading into this concept of the Fourth World War, which you take inspiration from the work of Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatistas. San Francisco, is it correct to say that San Francisco is one of the fronts, or at least experimental laboratories, in the technologies of new social warfare? Because I don't hear much about San Francisco. Maybe it's just by particular circles, my interest in sort of cybernetics and counter-insurgency. But it seems like there's something of a, I mean, there are tech bro fascist cults that seem to be running a little bit rampant over there. I mean, Bernard, what's his name? Balaji Srinivasan, the network state people, the grey movement. You've got Peter Thiel on the East Coast. You have Balaji on the left, on the West Coast, and everything seems to be more about terms of experimenting with these very Randian techno utopians, and they seem to be able to at least affect local mayoral and even district attorney elections over there. I mean, to what extent has since the events that inspired or led to the data really of this book, how do you think San Francisco fares as a kind of a front in this war, and how do we talk about the war in general? Because, and is it correct to think of it as a bit of a laboratory for new forms of techno-feudalism in terms of where the ideas are being generated, influence on local policy, for example?
Well, yeah. Well, I think one argument we would make is that there are obviously, and I think we're in agreement with that, there are multiple sites of this kind of counterinsurgent technological innovation in terms of different kinds of warfares. And to always keep in mind that it's not just one form of warfare. In other words, not just Westphalian ground troops and ground assaults. So for us, Ani did a lot of work in Kashmir. And of course, we're always thinking about the counterinsurgency directed in Chiapas and other parts of southern Mexico. But also the U.S.-Mexico border has been, for a long time, a critical site of this kind of innovation. But in terms of the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and Ani can talk more about how she developed this further in the book, but we had a long discussion in precisely in this context to think about what we mean by the Silicon Valley. And there's a lot of interesting stories about how people respond to what we were trying to think through around the Silicon Valley, in the sense that as you know, so and you just named a number of kind of groups that kind of identify and intersect and kind of occupy this kind of space. But just on a really basic level, we think of the rise of the military-industrial complex in the immediate moment of the Second World War and since, Berkeley and down to LA, in terms of private and university kind of combined interests that in LA, Santa Barbara, and through up to South City, to San Francisco, Palo Alto, of course. So what we try to do is kind of problematize the very notion of Silicon Valley, and then argue that there's a long history of an emerging infrastructure, social economic and institutional of the military industrial complex that we earlier were talking about, the Rand Corporation, for example, and all of that, it really is kind of spread out across California, really since the middle of the Second World War, and advances and so on. So that's kind of one key element. Another element, of course, is to think about counterinsurgency not just in terms of the kind of specificity of what we typically think of Westphalian War, but so South City is the biggest biotech center in the world, and biotech is about biocapitalism. Biotech is about counterinsurgency. That in your book, the Anti-Oculus book, is brilliant in its discussion of how much that is kind of organized and integrated into industry and capital itself. So that would be one kind of starting point for us, in that how we try to think that through. And then, of course, with the Rand Corporation, their invention of social net war to try to understand what the Zapatistas were doing is, kind of a critical turning point in the fact that they just announced themselves and revealed themselves in how they're constantly studying what they were calling social movements. And the irony, of course, is that they're always behind us. They're always they can't really keep up, because we don't use social movements anymore. That's a sociological category that we've long since abandoned. Anyway, I mean, there's more we could say, but that, I think, generally we have to start with rethinking, commonsensical notions of Silicon Valley and what tech traditionally does.
I would add to that too, that how some of the work that we've done collectively here is around mapping the Bay Area as an enclave economy. In other words, what are the ways that different components of the Bay are organized in terms of an enclave economy, and also, what does a cartography that looks like that? How does that expose sort of forms of differential policing across the Bay as well? That where you have property values, you have certain real estate adjacent to other areas, other forms of real estate, and both of those areas are policed differently. So we're also looking at a situation, I think, where, as Manolo's saying, like, there's certainly, the technical innovation out here and its links to policing. We have HP, we have all of the social media companies, we have Lockheed Martin, there's all all the taser maker, we have all of these corporations out here that are producing these technologies, but that are also changing the kind of economic landscape, which changes the policing relation and allows for, specific kind of and constant rearticulation of a racial regime that determines where policing can be directed, what bodies can move where, who belongs in the smart city, who doesn't, who has to work in the smart city, all of these kinds of things. So I think, something else around the Bay Area is really understanding it as this kind of cluster of properties and populations that inhabit those properties that are always sort of considered in terms of adjacency, and in terms of how does that adjacency direct policing? How does it privatize fear? How does it create its own kind of economy around criminalization and around value production and all these kinds of things, which are, obviously have been critical to the continued escalation of policing, which is never only directed at Black and Brown communities, it's directed at the gated communities, the safe spaces, all the spaces where, the target population that, can enjoy the lifestyle that it demands. In other words, where whiteness can flourish and be sort of protected and encircled by a kind of policing apparatus that continues to escalate.
One real quick kind of follow up to that point. I mean, it's exactly this point that. So, and this, you're not going to be able to say anything with any kind of specificity. We need to start this research. At least we do. CCRA, we're not up to date on this, but obviously, the connection between Tel Aviv and Silicon Valley, and so it's extended out, right? It's dispersed in some way, and where there's an exchange And there's, as kind of Ani mentioned, kind of a very specific exchange around training. And first, idea forces came to L.A. and came to New York, and now New York and L.A. cops are going to, going there, and so there's this ongoing, very dense relations and exchange of information and strategy and tactic and trainings and tools, mechanisms and so on. I think that we really need to start kind of documenting and specifying all those elements.
Mm-hmm. No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, not even in terms of the latest tech pro gimmicks of like AI and the like, but even just thinking about the lower level, the stuff that I focus on in a lot of my work is micro work, the sort of work where people are displaced and having to do little tasks like checking a Google query or doing captures to find faces that look like theirs. And this is exactly that internet linkage. I mean, we could start with the military history. We could talk about, what the Brits learned in Northern Ireland, that the Israelis use on Palestinians, and they mutually exchange that. So many tech billionaires go, the Zionist entity known as Israel likes to call itself the startup nation for a reason. And we can see with the rise in, the end of the free money era towards the end of the interest rates, they have to defend their capital through a union with policing. But as you say, that the policing, the warfare is already built into data sets themselves. I can't help but think of, in particularly gig work. Obviously, precarious labor is always going to be policed in that way, but particularly delivery. I guess we have Deliveroo and Uber Eats here. You guys have Uber Eats and I guess DoorDash, and it does require people who are highly precaritized, usually from racialized backgrounds and racialized existences, not just a background that's racialized, and they have to go into these gated communities and have to be essentially policed in advance. Their boss is an app, which allows for some ways of producing knowledges that apps won't recognize because they don't want to spend that much money on it, and that's why they have to get the police involved. But it really is the frontier at every aspect of work now, because we can't not move around in any so-called smart city without producing data. And this isn't just a paranoiac thing about every time you use a card someone's looking at you, but no, there is a bit of value there that's usually sold on to someone in terms of producing this. And this could, in a way, it's not paranoiac in the sense of they're actively looking necessarily, but they're always trying to preempt in the way their activity is always trying to be preemptive. And to that extent, absolutely, we cannot really talk about the tech bro economy. That makes it sound more fanciful than it is. Just the general economic aspect of precarious life and indebted life under contemporary neoliberal capitalism, and indeed the frontiers of the genocidal zones. I mean, to use Césaire's boomerang, these technologies are being tested. I mean, this was actually, you mentioned Kashmir earlier, one of the big direct action groups in the UK against the genocide, Palestine Action. One of the ways in which they got Elbits, the drone manufacturers, the community eventually got them to go back to where the hell they came from and shut their factory down, was because they said, these weapons, they're built here, but they're tested in Palestine, but they're used in Kashmir. Obviously, the test use distinction doesn't really work there, but that's the rhetorical flourish of it. And I think if people start realizing that we're all feeding the beast here. I mean, we have a lot of academics in the audience, a lot of teachers. Turnitin, the anti-plagiarism software, that data set going straight into ChatGPT, folks. It is anything is being recorded, not in the sense that there's a central node of a mysterious cabal, and that's a very problematic word, of people's controlling everything, but rather these systems reflexively have control. And in California, they have from their very beginning. I mean, I don't need to tell you this, I'm just telling its listeners, the Malcolm Harris's book on Palo Alto, the RAND conferences, and their hilarious failure to apply their own principles to do counterinsurgency in Vietnam. Although, they seem to have worked a bit better domestically. And folks, you can actually go read all of the RAND corporation manuals. Paths to Victory is free online. And that's that was the thing I really sort of dug my sort of teeth into in terms of their counterterrorism stuff. Although it's interesting that the main recommendation of the RAND sort of scientists is one thing that none of the fronts of the current Fourth World War really seem to be able to do, because I don't know if you folks have read Paths to Victory, but their main suggestion is it's probably best to just rectify some people's grievances. since the Soviets have stopped pointing a nuclear warhead at everyone's faces in the West, or at least the heads of our states, or everyone really, our leaders no longer feel so inclined as to engage in, I guess, what was the classic 20th century counterinsurgent measure, which was the welfare state. It was a bit of a way of dividing people from the imperial court and the periphery. But rather than me ranting anymore, let's just, before we get on to, sorry, now I've started myself off now. Let's particularly go to one of the central concepts of the war aspect here, and the way in which it is becoming more diffuse and particularly informal, non-Westphalian. I mean, we can see this with, I don't really think there is a Westphalian genocide, but in terms of, the diffuse way in which we are preempted, policed, and channeled in advance towards certain ends of value production. And that is this concept generated from, sort of fused from Foucault, and I think people at Grassroots as well, that general post-Foucauldian, post-Marxist theoretical lineage, which is the concept of the war police assemblage, and how this concept can help us understand the general informalization of counterinsurgency today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of our points of reference for that actually comes out of security studies as well. They're thinking that through in some really interesting ways. But this book by Colleen Bell, Holmquist, and there's another name, Bachman, Bell, and Holmquist have done really interesting work on this. But I think there's a lot that can be said there. I think it kind of also it dovetails quite nicely with some of what you were laying out around a kind of history of counterinsurgency theory and also the social factory. And one of some of the ways that as a concept, we find that as a strategic concept, it becomes a helpful tool for us is because it names a number of kind of things that have been named in other ways, but it helps kind of frame them. So for instance, something like it helps question any imagined conceptual distinction or practical distinction between the military and the police, and invites us to always see those as a shared project that both, not just in terms of something like the 1033 program, or not just like, it's not only that we sometimes get some equipment that was destined for another theater of war, so to speak. It's also like we, as you were mentioning, the RAND connection, a lot of the, different arenas of French and British colonial occupation that helped develop theories around counterinsurgency, that, so much of the ways that policing in the U.S. developed, as people know, has been through a lot of these counterinsurgent theorists that were paratroopers in Algeria or paratroopers in Kenya or in Northern Ireland, or these kind of direct lessons learned from colonial occupations that then were directly brought by RAND Corporation to kind of have these conversations to influence policing and vice versa. The whole connection that you mentioned with Vietnam. So it in fact, people, police chief, people coming back from Vietnam as soldiers in Vietnam and directly becoming some of the most horrific and prominent police chiefs in departments in the U.S., like Bratton or John Burge in Chicago. But so the concept helps us to not see that distinction not be happy with that distinction, and always see these as two projects that are evolving simultaneously, but also to question the kind of any assumption that there's a difference between war and peace, right? So in other words, the war police assemblage is always calling into attention the fact that, that peace is always a project of pacification, which is another manifestation of a kind of war that's not, we don't have these certain areas where something's at peace and it can be policed, and something's at war and we need the military to arrive, right? That these are relational areas and relational practices. I think that, one of the things that becomes valuable in trying to understand it in the current conjuncture that we've been naming it in relation to the Fourth World War is, and, this is where all of us can get into our counterinsurgency history and is that one of the things that counterinsurgency theorists have been very explicit about is that, the target of counterinsurgency is the population, right? In other words, that it's a way that the war has moved into the battlefield now is the relations between people, among communities, right? That the war is actually the battlefield is a social site. And so, one of the things that is happening within this moment is that people are marking moments where the military is taking on more policing functions, and again, not to just to mark like the way some of these practices are shifting the social terrain. So something like a counterinsurgency practice that can be enacted in an explicit way by either military personnel or by policing personnel is one that seeks an interventionist approach to the population that it's attempting to manage or occupy. The one that wants it's a policing force that wants to manage movement, manage circulation, that wants to know, it wants to identify, it wants to classify, right? That all of these become part of this like larger policing practice, which is in fact advances the war, supports the war, and makes, the war, as Marcos says, ongoing and everywhere. But I think the other thing that's helpful about specifically to focus on this idea of the assemblage, like so war and police, but also the assemblage, is that it offers a profound kind of opportunity for rupture and resistance in that. And the Zapatistas have been writing about this a lot lately, that don't imagine that Fortress Europe is infallible. Don't imagine that the future that looks no future, no alternative. Don't imagine, there are cracks in that. Like we have to always keep these cracks open. And I think the idea of an assemblage also, it helps us see something that looks like a totality that becomes difficult to dismantle, disrupt. It reminds us that it's not a totality, and that it can, we can find cracks in that in a different way, and that it's always an interplay between parts. And how can that inform our strategy on the ground as we're confronting this? So those would be some of the I'm sure you both have tons of stuff to say about that, but maybe just to quickly link that to the social factory too, is that, I think that one of the reasons we identified the social factory as a conceptual term here to think through these struggles is really reflects a recognition and an experience of policing that targets home and community life, that doesn't just target trenches and airports, and it's not fixated only on military targets. It's constantly one that is, through direct or less direct mechanisms, is always policing schools. It's policing criminalization in the home, or it's apportioning criminalization to the home. And so this idea that if we understand that, capital relations have leapt from the factory walls, in kind of Tronti's term, and are now permeate all of society, how do we understand the ways that policing and its imperatives are also directed at this social world, which is counterinsurgency theory is very explicit that that's its focus is the population itself, and destroy, reorder, rebuild, or destroy, this kind of imperative to constantly reorganize a social world and the relations of that world so that they fit a capitalist imperative.
Well, in terms of the just very briefly, I mean, yeah, the extent to which counterinsurgency is so diffuse that it primarily sees everyone as a potential, not even as a potential suicide bomber, as in they are a ticking time bomb to insert, with that line between civilian and civil war, civil agent, civil war fighter becomes completely blurred, or at least or possibly even eliminated. I mean, to the extent that, we could very easily think of what Governor Newsom is doing in California with the vast displacements, the social cleansing, essentially, which is indetachable from an ethnic cleansing of the unhoused population in California. Smiling as he's sweeping and throwing away people's tents. And in a way, it kind of feels like counterinsurgency has, in a way, divested itself entirely from the half of it which wanted to give anyone anything. The capital no longer needs to buy us off. I mean, there's this thing I use in the book from Jason Reed, his book on Spinoza and Marx, one of his books on Spinoza and Marx, which is that the money mechanism is no longer sort of to give you a hope, and America sort of stands in for that perfect hope there of, give me your huddled masses yearning to be free, and is more just money as a way of deterring the eviction arrival of the police, the deportation arrival of the police. It's a mechanism of fear primarily. I mean, the state feels like it doesn't need to give us anything anymore. I mean, this was kind of the deal with democracy itself. The parties would compete to give us things, and we wouldn't, burn them down or use the Second Amendment, because law-abiding gun owners are kind of a contradiction in terms if you're thinking about the spirit and the word of the law there. But they have completely forsaken that because the control systems become so ingrained. And I don't think they know that they are this ingrained at it. I just think that they haven't had the kind of pushback or been allowed or have allowed themselves to see the kind of pushback that does happen in order to change course.
Just two things quickly, because I think this also, as we were developing the idea of the social factory, it served it allowed us to the concept itself, which derived from the Italian autonomous feminists that came out of operaismo moment, Federici, Della Costa and James, Fortunati. We drew on that explicitly. And in fact, we also convened as part of Unitera Califas and CCRA, we convened a social factory Ateneo once a month together with families as a way to help generate an analysis of this moment as we were walking with families in this struggle and thinking collectively around that. But two things in relation to what you just said is, one of the ways that we've been able to use that category effectively is not just to see, the household as a site of capitalist discipline and a site of where, labor is produced but unwaged, right? These are the kind of care work is not recognized, all these kinds of things. The other thing that the analysis of the social fact, what these Italian feminists did with their analysis was that they pointed to sites of value production that we don't often see because there's a mechanism that capitalism has put into place, a technology like the wage, the instrument of the wage that makes that it doesn't only devalue the work that's done in the home, it devalues the work that's done in the home as a way of it devalues the work that's done in the home, and in so doing devalues those who do it. And so one way to think of like the work that they did around the wage in the social factory was that it was what is a mechanism that devalues some lives, and in what way is that working, and what purpose does that serve for capital, and how does it point to, can we learn from that areas where folks are being made disposable, and for what reason, right? Or attempted to be made, they're being cast with this net of disposability. And that's always also a racialized, project, a race project. But the other thing just quickly about this is that, as we all know as well, that the in their analysis of the role of the instrument of the wage, they were able to point to a site of value production that wasn't normally thought of as a site of value production within capital. And so also, one of the ways that we've been looking at this question in relation to counterinsurgency and policing in the Bay Area, and what families have sort of ways that they've, responded to this and fought back on this, is that it also points to sites where values being produced through criminalization and policing. So of course, we know this, right? But there's like tremendous value being produced by all of these people that don't have anywhere to go on the streets, right? Like policing budgets just keep ramping up. It articulates with different property values. There's, we can sell Ring cameras, we can sell fences, all of these kinds of stuff. So there's, the moment somebody is incarcerated or killed by police, there's the apparatus that starts to generate value around even that dead body and proliferate value through the court system, through all the things that have to happen following that death, is also like a site of value production that we were interested in using that category to think through exactly the kind of things that you're raising around the homeless, the houseless population, people that are being moved and devalued, is like, how does this, they're abandoned by capital, but how does capital also benefit from this abandonment in a number of ways, both in terms of the productions of subjectivities that can be articulated around that, I'm a good worker, I'm not this person, so like, yeah, anyway, I just wanted to add that quickly. Manolo, sorry to jump in front of you.
Oh, no, I was just going to add that, in terms of the question of Fourth World War that we were talking about, just the idea that we also insist in, the kind of category, war, police, assemblage, the question of Fourth World War, in the sense that war is really three wars, three elements of warfare. Obviously, a counterinsurgency against the refusal of the imposition of racial patriarchal capital. But, that is going back as far back as the 1500s, and then that being also understood as a more complex war against subsistence, and that can be in our our everyday lives and the sites of conviviality, meaning the sites where we're interdependent and able to rely on each other as we're regenerating our communities in very localized places in dialogue with the logic of that watershed. And capital wants to disrupt that moment of subsistence. And then the other, of course, is the forgetting and oblivion that capital wants to impose as we again forget our victories and forget our resistances and so on. So we will always try to think of that, and this really kind of brought into focus for us through the Zapatistas and their claim about the Fourth World War, and their emphasis that, well, this is no longer directed by the nation state or the decorum that was organized through the nation and the systems of nations, which again has its history, before Westphalia. It has its history in the early 1500s with the Spanish, Victoria, and these cats who are inventing the state and the system of nations and defining war and warfare for market purposes to control the extraction of indigenous labor and indigenous wealth that is in the quote unquote new world. So all that is 150 years before, 100 years before Westphalia. So the argument we're trying to make is that to get out of the epistemological kind of framework of good wars and bad wars, and that this war has a beginning and an end, and it has some kind of moral justification, and all of that, that essentially masks slavery and colonial extraction from Europe's first arrival on the west coast of Africa and then in the Americas. So to try to kind of break that down and think of then, well, what is this ongoing war against subsistence? What are these multiple strategies of counterinsurgency, and how are they evolving and changing? And yes, they're controlling populations, they're dividing communities, they're detaching us from our subsistence, right? And subsistence in a very broad sense. And then, of course, the forgetting and oblivion. So one of the ways we're also trying to think that through is that warfare also tries to attach us to commodity, so that we have unquestioned affiliation or attachment to commodity, not just labor, but commodity more broadly in its production of value. And then how do we detach ourselves from that? And part of that is to try to understand the ideological surplus value that's produced, such that we don't question that attachment. And these are various technologies, one technology being the very technology of war and warfare, history, time, war, these big kind of tools of systems of modernity that we take for granted. And we don't question settler time. We don't question history, capital H, in terms of these kind of grand narratives that are in service of nation building and attachments to nation. And then also the very notion of warfare. It's the same way we would think of like questioning, progress and development, and taking a step back. And then also obviously technologies around race and gender as fundamentally technologies of warfare, and determining what body has a value, and how that value will be established. So then back to the U.S.-Mexico border, it's a dispositif to produce precisely that subject, but to reinforce the kind of notions of racial difference and racial hierarchy, such that we can be back, attached to commodity in that way. And it works. I mean, obviously, here we have this spectacle of Trump saying whatever he wants to say about immigrants. So, that's not possible without the dispositif, to use our Foucault, the dispositif of the border as a device. So that's one thing we try to think that through with the Zapatistas, like, where they've made this kind of concept of Fourth World War. We've tried to bring more into focus the kind of notion of war against subsistence, which is a phrasing by Illich. to again to try to understand the emergence of racial patriarchal capital, from the 1500s. And for Illich, that wasn't just kind of technologies of what we typically think of warfare. It was also like, for example, the imposition of a universal language, the imposition of Spanish to tie people to the nation. And the term we use for all of this to kind of bring it back together in terms of race is Du Bois's notion of democratic despotism. So that idea that there's going to be extraction of black and brown bodies, and that's going to continue. And warfare is just a way to mask that extraction. Achille Mbembe is also making this point. And Mark Neocleous would be, I think, another person here in this dialogue. Like, these are just systems to, peace becomes a discourse to mask this massive extraction, ongoing violent extraction. And Du Bois said that war can work through our attachments to an armed national association. So that, and that attachment is also organized through the privileges of whiteness. Who has access to whiteness in regards to the armed national association? And then, if we can't disrupt that, we're going to continue to organize wars and be on this or that side of it to extract from black and brown bodies globally. And the term he was using was democratic despotism for that.
I just to pick up something as well you said regarding sort of the attachment we have to commodities. I mean, I remember reading this from an anarchist pamphlet. I'm going to hold this up to the camera for the YouTube watchers here. This is a bottle of beer. You're not going to get one of these in Chiapas. Modelo have tried. They really have tried to get beer into Chiapas. The Zapatistas know what they're doing with this. They are going to. It's a settled tactic as old as the American project itself. It is the attempt to. Don't worry, listeners. It's Saturday night where I am. It is the actual content to get you attached to that. I mean, you can even think about the disposable vaporizer, the one use. I mean, it's the perfect counter-insurgent commodity. It's a metal incredibly precious, such that if people Elon Musk saying that we will coup Bolivia for it, and thankfully that failed. It's a commodity that presupposes an economy of child miners to produce commodities that are aimed directly at addicting children. It is maddening how diffuse this is, and I know we sort of sometimes I'll show sort of straddles between sort of the Marxist and the post-Marxist lens, but this is, Annie, you mentioned Selma James. This is bog standard Marxism. Part of the surplus value generated by the worker is the fact that you only have to pay them for as much as it is to keep them working, and all the longer time that they have to work, you pay them so they can make 40 shoes, but the cost of feeding them is less than how much you can sell those 40 shoes from. But hold up, you haven't paid the person who's reproduced the worker. You haven't paid the person who, in very traditional, I'm going by a very Fordist patriarchal model here, because that's the one that's dominant, that does the so-called gendered labors of ironing shirts, looking after the kids, dealing with, when they've drunk themselves into a stupor because they hate their job and they hate, themselves. It is all of that left, completely left out of the blue. And in terms of, even thinking about, and I think there's something that definitely stretches across the Atlantic here, the way that the police treats the mothers of victims of police violence. In the UK, I mean, I read some of the case, for example, the disinformation and the sort of the ways in which, the police try to avoid telling anything to people, like Alex Nito's mother, as mentioned in the book, or in the UK, the Doreen Lawrence, who was the mother of Stephen Lawrence, who was murdered by supremacists, eventually got jailed, but the police spied on her, made her a baroness, because Britain likes to give sort of tokens like that, and even then that's always by waving a sword around in front of them. And it is I keep saying maddening. It's not the best term, because madness is itself an apparatus of counterinsurgency, as we know from history of Geppetto, anything from Geppetto mania, runaway slave disease, as they called it, to the mass diagnoses of schizophrenia, of the Black Panther militants, and the very invention of lobotomy, distribution of Valium. We see it now of the way the police. I've seen reports of police injecting people with Narcan when not overdosing, or when in Canada, those free, safe disposal sites being shut down. From one can have legal marijuana, but And that's probably because you can't really overdose on it. It is one of those Modelo-like commodities. And I mean, I guess I know as we're coming towards the hour here, talking about examples of insurgent knowledges. Can we talk about some of the examples? Doesn't necessarily have to be from the book. We could talk about more recent examples, but what examples really stand out to you in terms of the informational war and the ways in which we might not notice necessarily these more subtle, diffuse forms of counterinsurgency for what they really are?
Well, one insurgent knowledge that we are always kind of in dialogue with and listening, kind of trying to learn how to listen, of course, is the insurgent knowledges that are generated around Zapatismo. And that, that's, of course, central here, the Zapatistas, but not only the Zapatistas in dialogue with other communities of struggle and folks that they've invited to be part of, these ongoing conversations, these ongoing encuentros. And the knowledge gets generated through this process of, sharing a palabra and then activating a group of folks and then thinking together and sharing what knowledges that they have and then producing something different and new knowledges and so on. And then the very idea of recovering knowledge as a political practice, right? And what it means to actually engage in quote unquote historical knowledges of struggle or poetics of struggle. And then to circulate those, to archive those, make those more available, and how do we share our word? And in sharing our word, can we share a dream? And preguntando, caminando, we're together, we're walking and we're asking and thinking out loud together. So, we've been trying to think that through with Zapatistas and some of their spaces they've convened, their direct actions and their analysis that they make available. And ask what does that, what challenge or opportunity does that pose for us in the most immediate kind of local sense. And in part it is a response, like, well, how are they responding to this ongoing brutal counterinsurgency that they're constantly facing? And then of course from 95 to the present, that counterinsurgency has changed somewhat. And what one point you could argue was more directed by the state and more managed by the state with various kind of specific class interests, elite economic interests through the state, and now it's more and more inflected by the narco, what quote unquote folks call narco, and and the question is, did narco take over and invade and manipulate the state, or did the state become narco? And for us, like that kind of brings us back against this war against subsistence. It's capital's always been this. Capital's always try to manage and invent and create new ways to diminish our relation to each other and our rootedness in subsistence. And so we're learning a lot from the Zapatistas in that sense, as you're kind of suggesting that there's no alcohol, there's no drugs in Zapatista territory. They have a very studied relationship with commodity, let's say, not participating in the state, spectacles and performances around quote unquote elections and so on. And of course, paid prices for all of these kinds of notion at the same time that they are trying to very clearly demonstrate or declare like what their autonomy is about and to share what they're learning in regards to their autonomy with, like, for example, the Escuelita. They invited folks to actually come down and participate in their everyday subsistence practice of the community's regeneration, and this interdependence that we could, observe directly. So yeah, then when we ask that question, well, what does subsistence look like in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, in Silicon, in the middle of the Silicon Valley? What does subsistence, look like? Is that growing revolutionary tomatoes outside your balcony, or what are we really trying to do in terms of thinking about subsistence? So that brings us back to the idea of detaching ourselves from commodity. What does that detachment actually really look like? As that commodity goes by, like nonprofit industrial complex commodifies the struggle of mothers, and then tries to prop up one mother, the legal apparatus and the nonprofit working, and one family gets money and then the other family doesn't, and it divides the community. A perfect strategy of counterinsurgency. It completely unravels, it deactivates the movement, it unravels the relations that are kind of what we've been trying to rebuild in the moment of fierce care. And that's commodity. That's some form of commodity.
I mean, one of the examples that I would put forward, because it's so rich for actually thinking about we're talking a lot about abstraction. And, I think often that the work that mothers are doing, the Zapatistas have also been very much highlighting the mothers who are seeking out the bodies of their disappeared children. That's been a huge sort of going back to that and saying we need to take this struggle seriously. And I think we do. And I think there's a lot of ways that so much of the struggles around policing, to confront policing and to confront prisons by design gets funneled back into an engagement with the state. So the state can constantly control the timing of your justice, that where you have to show up, all of these kinds of things. And so, looking at areas where families and, primarily mothers, but aunts, all the family members have both a lot of where they're visible in media and in news is in that moment of direct confrontation, which also often doesn't necessarily account for all the ways they're also confronting the abstractions that they know are also producing violence and impacting their lives. And so one of the strategies that we saw maybe let me also say this first, that some of the work that's coming out of Mexico around the mothers of the disappeared is this analysis of, at a certain point, all the mothers are going through the halls of the state and coming up with no answers, and they're speaking with each other, and there's a shared experience of a state that does not exist, that is not there for them, that this does produce a collective experience. But one of the things that we have been, part of, paying attention of, in awe of out here is different tools and strategies that are coming out of the communities. And one that's been really effective that there's just so much to think about is the ways that families are using practices of vigil on the sites where their children were killed in the city, that completely obstructs the city from its dream of always tomorrow, never yesterday. The city that dreams its own clean future of progress. That these vigils that come back to the same spot year after year, in increments, that invite other families to come and also speak about what has happened in their community. So like everything that is designed to individuate us in our death, or in that killing that individuates people, the refusal to kind of participate in that, to kind of reclaim all these other families coming back, a refusal to let, our Foucault here, but, a refusal to let death be banished from the city, refusal to accept the violent partition between life and death, which is, that's a modernist frame that, there's all sorts of vernacular experiences of the living and the dead that don't accept that bifurcation. So there's all sorts of ways that family members are also, very explicitly they're not showing up at a vigil with a demand that the judge recognize a case, or sometimes they are maybe, but they'll do it years after the state process is totally done, and continue this kind of mode, which is creating an open space of listening and an open space of sharing these knowledges, like the knowledges that they know about, which police officer is where, what department did he get moved to after he killed someone. They're sharing all of these kind of knowledges that, every press release that the police put out is masks this war, circulates disinformation. And so they become these kind of profound sites where they can continue to circulate information about the way their community is being policed and confront the abstractions that are apportioned to them, including criminalization. One of the things that a lot of the families have done out here is recognize, similar to there's not a good war, there's not a bad war. They recognized it immediately as a strategy of divide and conquer. If you start creating a hierarchy of good victims and bad victims, in other words, was my kid innocent? Was mine going to college? Was yours a gangbanger, all this kind of stuff. They realized that that was a completely divisive strategy and overcame it through the construction of a number of these spaces that, as we said, there's a lot to unpack there, but a number of ways that the insurgent, disqualified, subjugated knowledges that they're insisting on bringing forward don't only exist as counter knowledge, they also exist in the production of a world that refuses to be framed by the epistemology of this one.
That's just a beautiful phrase to end it on. I mean, in terms of the distinction being made, we can see it between both private companies and state apparatuses. I mean, thinking about the opioid crisis, the Sacklers' preferred narrative about, our drugs only kill the people who abuse them, junkies and the like. And we can see this. We can see the creative divisions, which they are genuinely real abstractions, and the way in which we create counter knowledges, and indeed knowledges that allow us to have a kind of nutrition from them. I mean, the term information diet wasn't exactly made by a counter-insurgent theorist, but in terms of there's a reason why the social media streams of data are called feeds. But on that note, I just want to say, Annie, Manolo, thank you so much for joining us. If you folks want to read the book, you can actually find it now. It's out now, I believe, from Northwestern University Press. It's The War on the Social Factory, The Struggle for Community Safety in the Silicon Valley. For UK comrades, actually, I do want to, if you're interested in what we've spoken about today, there's actually an exhibition happening in London right now which covers a lot of this. It's called Hard Graft. I went there recently. It has its stuff. It's talking about sort of the work we don't typically value, and there's a whole section of the exhibit on Selma James and the wages to housework movement, sex worker occupations of various chapels across France and UK, and an amazing exhibition on Death Alley in Louisiana and the way in which the state and the industry has tried to individuate Black communities by obscuring plantation grave sites. And this is all part. It is the extent to which you can find this everywhere is staggering. But of course, we can't just start blankets out by having counterinsurgency as an abstract concept. We need to look at places where people are. And I think this book is a fantastic way to do that, because the way it is structured purely by actual examples of where the police and community intersect, end up into conflict, when people are killed by the police, people are killed by their conditions of work, and how the state tries to tamper these responses from boiling over into active revolt. And I want to thank you both for coming on. I thank you for writing this book, and we'll have it all linked below. We'll have the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy linked below as well, and people can find out. What's next for the project so far? Are there any other things that our listeners and our community can join, and how do they get involved?
It's a great question. First of all, thank you so much, Adam, Acid Horizon, also Manolo. I feel like we could open another beer over here, even though it's not night, and continue this conversation for a long time. And I hope it's the first of many times that we can connect across these projects. Manolo and I are actually working on a book right now on community safety, so maybe that'll give us a reason to be back in touch. And thank you so much for supporting us around this. You can also look us at you could reach out to us. We regularly convene spaces as part of Uni Tierra Califas that are always open to the public, that are blended spaces, virtual and in person right now in Oakland, and also blended that people can join. Manolo, what would you add to that?
Yeah, we have an Ateneo that's open to comrades, and we'd love to have folks join us. Yeah, looking forward to keeping the dialogue going for sure.
Well, comrades, counterinsurgency, you should be interested in it, listeners, because it is interested in you. And on that note, I will say thanks everyone for listening. Annie, Manolo, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you folks next time.
Thank you for listening, and if you made it this far, it probably means you love Acid Horizon, so go ahead and navigate to the show notes and find the link to our latest project, the Kickstarter link, and support Acephalus, the erotic tarot of George Bataille and its companion compendium of essays.